Good day. Welcome to the Trendy Place. This is the Trend Podcast with Justin A.Williams. And today we have a special episode for you. We're going to be talking about my book, Reborn Virtues Constellation. And it's going to be a little bit of a different format. I'm actually going to have questions directed towards me by my great publisher, Robbie Grayson of Traitmarker Books and Publishing. And we're going to have some fun with it. And you're going to learn more about not only the story, but you're going to learn a lot about me, the author. And yes, I'm going to kick it to Robbie. Robbie, how's it going?
Hey, man, it's going well. Like I said, it's pretty cold down here in Nashville this morning. I think it's like the first official day of fall. Now, it wasn't the first day of frost. We had that 2 weeks ago, but still it warms up pretty hot in the afternoons. But today it's that change. We're in the fall. So, yeah, doing really well. Life is good.
Well, it must be beautiful down there. I've been knowing that I've been there.
Yeah, there's leaves all over the place, all over the ground, so it's beautiful. And I live in a great little town, the little town of Franklin. At one point, the 14th most popular small town to live in the United States. I think it's still like in the top 20. Anyways.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, well, I can tell. I mean, if anyone's ever been to Franklin, it's a beautiful town. People are very nice, polite. It's peaceful. It's got kind of this different spirit than Nashville, but it's still a great place to visit. So I loved it.
Yeah. So, anyways, so your book. This is kind of interesting because I'm actually going to become the interviewer.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I want to make two corrections. First of all, I know you refer to your book as Virtues Constellation, but it's not online as Virtues Constellation. It's online as Reborn. So I want to make sure that people know the title of the book so they don't get a little confused. Virtues Constellation, it's the first book, in the series. So
yes.
Second of all, one of the reasons I suggested that we do the podcast the way that we're going to do it is because there's a lot of YA authors out there who are writing books. They've got great books out there. In fact, I've published a few. And however, oftentimes they use me as a sounding board to determine whether or not to give them feedback on whether or not their book actually resonates. If their book is good, if the storyline or the plot line or the Handlung, as the Germans say, is, right where it needs to be. And I always direct the author to the experiences in their own lives because, as Stephen King says, plot does not come before story. And that's his very unique perspective. So he is not a fan of the hero's journey in terms of a template. He says, no, what you do is you figure out who your author is, and then you figure out what decision your author would make in any given situation. So book, I feel your book is more like written the Stephen King's way, but there definitely is that hero's journey template in there. There's all of those elements in there, which make it exciting. But one of the bottom line values of this podcast for other YA authors is to kind of get a peek in on the life of an author who's written a very successful book on the writing process. And so, by the way, thank you very much for not only, this is a beautiful book, but hey,
it is.
You wrote a really nice note to me on the inside of this book. I appreciate that. So, so I wanted to start off by asking a very basic question. Where does this story come from? And specifically, where were you and what were the circumstances whereby this character Christian and his life situation in the book popped up in your mind and just kind of bore into your brain until you started writing?
So I think to start, it was the pandemic, it was COVID, and I was in graduate school at Rutgers University. And I was looking for a way of writing a book that would detail more about myself than any book I had planned or had written. As you know, I wrote a book before that, but that was in a draft stage. And that book was more about who I dreamed of myself being. The main character was Apollo, the Greek god. And I had, when I was a kid and growing up, people saw me as this kind of golden boy, tall, good looking, come from a nice family. Like Apollo, people reacted when I walked around. I had that kind of golden boy upbringing. But then when I got to college, and graduate school, I started to contemplate my own anxieties and my own frailties a little bit differently. As the audience might know, the main character deals with a mental health diagnosis. He's diagnosed as bipolar. Throughout the book, it's hinted that he may or may not be.
Hey, stop. I don't want you. Okay. Hey, don't give away the book is great.
Oh, my bad.
I want to make sure that the reader does not know too much about it because
My bad. Gotcha.
Your stories, and I like the way you're going. So
yeah.
so
I'll keep it personal. Yeah.
You were a golden boy.
Right.
You got all these attributes of having been a golden boy. Now your character, one little thing I will let potential readers know, is that Christian is not your main character, who is based on your bio and your life experiences. He is not at his best. He is kind of like a fallen golden boy. And there's very little, if no reference at all, to his previous privileged status. We find, as you were saying, you were writing during the pandemic, and you were wanting to do a book in contrast to another book you had written that was draft form. You wanted to write to detail your experience of going from what to what.
Yeah, I guess a golden boy to a fallen character, a fallen hero. That was kind of me. I was diagnosed with bipolar and anxiety when I was 22 years old. I also lost my father that year. I lost my best friend that year. And it took me a long time to recover. Through the process of writing this book, I had to do a lot of deep reflection on what I wanted to be. And I remember distinctly thinking about myself in the context of Greek mythology, just because Greek mythology was a place of safety for me. And the story of particularly my sister took me to see Hades Town, which is a play on Broadway, a great play, the story of Orpheus. And Orpheus, if you don't know, actually means darkness. That's his name is most likely translated into some semblance of the word darkness. But that's because that's what he goes into. He goes into the darkness of Hades. And myself wanted to find some way of expressing that I was not this golden boy. I feel more comfortable in a leather jacket, sitting at a dive bar, going to a punk rock show. I've always had that characteristic about myself. I don't know where it comes from. My dad was not like that. My mom is not like that. No one in my family imbues that kind of sensibility, that James Dean-ness. And I do. And so it's as much as I am a kind of an enigma and a mystery. Writing this book was kind of like that too, because during the pandemic, I think a lot of people were struggling with their own identities. We were at home, we were inside, we were not allowed to do certain things, and we had to really contemplate the future. And for me, the future was, well, I'm in graduate school. Do I really want to go into politics? I was a political scientist. I'm a political scientist by trade. But I didn't want to go to Washington, D.C., and work for peanuts and rise the ranks to just become a lobbyist or work for a senator. And I was never going to run for office. I don't think my politics really aligned um, with that journey. So the book was kind of an appeal to what I wanted to do in the future, and it was an appeal to who I wanted to discover in myself, come out as.
So it kind of, in a way, was kind of like a vision quest exercise with all the time you had because you were in lockdown.
Yeah.
And I will say, on top of this, I was just in New York City just recently, and while my Uber drivers were driving me around, I learned a lot about what life was like in New York City during the pandemic. In fact, it reminds me a lot of what the third iteration of A Quiet Place must have been, with the thousands of people dying each day and just the emptiness like on the streets and the anyways. So it's so really, in a sense, you're going through this personal journey, but you're also kind of going through this collective journey we all were, which is what comes after. And whatever comes after, we knew this. We knew that whatever came after was going to change what came before. We just didn't know what. So here you are, in a sense, kind of doing this vision quest, trying to figure out, when I do get out of lockdown and I put my feet to the streets again, what is that part of me that is the core version of myself? So before you got there, you really, like you said, had to detail how you got from one place to another. So going back to plot development or character development, the main character in Reborn Virtues Constellation is a young man named Christian who is in his senior year at the fictional Parthenon University, which is a reference to Princeton because
I went to Princeton.
You went to Princeton, exactly. And this this character, when we see Christian, we hear a lot of what life might have been like before, but what we see Christian basically sitting in a chair. He's waiting for his psychiatrist to come in because he has been essentially incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
Of course, he is anticipating being on his best behavior so he can get out, but he's got this voice in his head that his stay at the hospital was supposed to have, with meds and with, I guess, therapy, was supposed to have subdued or made go away. So here he's got this voice in his head. He's trying to be on his best behavior before the psychiatrist walks in. So why did you choose that moment to start the story?
I think for anybody who's diagnosed and you're dealing with the shock of, well, I feel healthy, I feel mentally healthy, I feel lucid, I don't think anything's wrong, but people are telling me something is deeply wrong. I think there's a level of pretending you can do to, if you're clever enough to, not, I wouldn't say trick people, but to calm their worry and let them think that maybe nothing is wrong. You also are, when you're newly diagnosed, you're thinking, well, maybe I can just time travel back to 5 days before and this thing won't be there. I was in situations like that where I had to sit in front of doctors and I had to tell them that, no, I'm fine and I'm good and I don't have any mania or depression or delusions or anything like that. At the same time, my whole main focus was on this theme of trying to rise above my human station. I looked to that inner voice, some call it spirit, God, universe, whatever. And I looked to that because I wanted to escape the horror that was happening around me. It was a struggle with my family. It was a struggle with doctors. It was a struggle with socially. It was like, well, now I'm a pariah. The school knows about it. So people that are not even doctors or trained to handle that information, according to HIPAA, now know detailed information about me that could be very incriminating and ostracizing. And so there were moments where I was on campus and, people just kind of knew or found out. And I felt like, why? At first I was like, why me? But then something kicked in, and this is what led me to write the book eventually, was, that golden boyness that I had as a kid, it wasn't totally untrue. I did try to be a hero to some people and help people. And in college, when I was diagnosed and came back, I wanted to stand up for myself and say, hey, like, it's still the same old me. Nothing has viscerally changed. In fact, I feel like now that I felt like now that my anxiety was being treated, that I was going to be even better. Of course, Princeton didn't end up the way I wanted it to. I didn't end up graduating. But we'll get to that later, that story when I was in the storm. But, I think that when you're sitting in front of a doctor and they're trying to convince you that of several things, that you're not okay, you need the medicine, and that things will get better if you follow their plan, I think I've been inspired recently by a lot of people who have challenged the notion that authority figures always know what they're doing. And in that scene, I think Christian is kind of like, well, I'm skeptical, of all this. And what do you really listen to as a human, right? Do you listen to the inner voice? When I was growing up, my pastor used to say, listen to the small, still voice. But that's what got me in trouble. That's what got me to that point, So it's like, what?
Okay, I've got to say that's interesting because I've seen so many correlations. I thought it interesting that you named the character Christian, who, as we watch him throughout his hero's journey, is pretty much kind of Christian, but anything but. So the whole notion of following that still small voice, that's priceless. I hadn't thought about that. So Christian is essentially in the proverbial hot seat, essentially auditioning to get out. That is to say, best behavior, giving the best performance. But surprisingly, so he's got these voices in his head. He's trying to do his best, in front of the psychiatrist, Dr. Accesso, which I thought was interesting as well, because that little scene reminded me of Morgan Freeman in the Shawshank Redemption, when he's standing before the parole board for the last time.
Right.
And they say, have you learned anything? And he just kind of
lets him have it.
This is the reverse of that, though. But Christian is I don't hear any voices. Well, but Dr. Accesso, you have a feeling that she might know that he does let them out anyways. So, I thought that was kind of interesting, having your character, seeing him, quite honestly, maybe at the very top of a very bottom of a very low experience. And we don't know what that experience was that landed him there until maybe the next chapter. So Christian gets out, and then eventually, we meet his parents, and you get an idea of how dysfunctional this family is, because you utilize very grandiose language to describe both Mr. and Mrs. Stone. So when it comes to the biographical kind of realities, like, how much of that is true to your own experience? Or what of the characterization of Mr. and Mrs. Stone was true to your own experience as a child through university?
Yeah, I think it's very true to life. So my father was very much like Stone. He was a charismatic, narcissistic kind of ladies' man, a Lothario, when he was younger, I guess my age when I was in college. And my mother was this dutiful, good girl that was waiting for her shining knight to come save her from the attic.
Hey, by the way, really quickly, I got to put a plug in for Dr. Teresa Taylor Williams' book, Death of the Good Girl. You can find it on Amazon and anywhere books are sold online. All right, go back.
Yes, great book. So, my mother was always deferring to my father. And you see that in the scene where she's silent. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, my mom was not a silent necessarily person. When I was in trouble for whatever reason, or I had to have a conversation with my father, my mother would be there and she would talk, but it was never speaking to power. It was never in defense of me. It was never to save me from this person who, quite frankly, could be quite maniacal.
Really quickly, tell me, you told me a story yesterday that I want you to repeat for our audience. You gave me an example of how your mother, who, by the way, Mrs. Stone in the book, just seems to be a maybe shadow of herself in the presence of her husband. You said that your mother would not, the mother in the book, isn't really there to protect her son. You know, you told me about a story, a party that you went to.
Oh yeah. So like I said, I was kind of the golden boy when I was in high school. I never got in trouble, never did anything against my what my parents told me to do. But one night, I was like, you know what? I'm a senior. I've never been to a high school party. I'm gonna go with one of my friends. We went, and I was having a good time. And then within 15 minutes, it got broken up by the cops. Now, the cops made us all call our parents to go home. I was distraught because I knew I was going to be in trouble. So I called my mother instead of my father. My mother came and picked me up, and I begged her. I begged her like you could not believe. I mean, with so many tears, just do not tell dad. Do not tell dad. There's no need to tell him. He thinks I'm at sleeping over my friend's house. There's no need to tell him. Like literally, legitimately, because I got compliments from the cops. The cops came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for helping us clean up the party, clean up the beer, for being polite, for not being argumentative." My friend was very, very rude to the cops and being cantankerous and arrogant and yelling at them. And I was the opposite. So, like, you know, I was engendering the golden boy kind of thing. I thought that's what you're supposed to do, and you get a reward. Now, when I went home, she told my dad, and she had promised she wouldn't. I was actually, I think, when I got home, I was asleep, and then I got woken up to, and imagine you're sleeping, you're peaceful, and you woke up
and that's never good. That's happened to me before many times.
Yeah, and you've got this 6'5", 330-pound Herculean man irate at you, telling me that shit like I have to protect your sisters from you, and making me feel like I was just some bum who was a danger to people, when the opposite was true. And I knew that was true. And that was the first time I said to myself, you know, this guy's got a problem. This guy's got a real problem, because this isn't me. I always blamed myself, but I was like, this isn't me. I did everything by the book. They should be proud of me by how I behaved, and they're not. And that's when I turned to the power, I think, of vengeance, of hatred, of the Sith, if you want to follow the Star Wars model. I said, you know, I'm going to give in to my passions now, because I'm doing everything by the book and I'm still getting treated like this. I think I gave you a metaphor yesterday of how I looked at my parents when I was a kid. My mom was Medusa. My dad was Hercules when I was drawing things. Hercules is a bull in a china shop. He'd be a terrible father. Just like his father Zeus, he'd be terrible. He can't control his own strength. He can't control his own maniacal need to dominate and empower himself off other people. My mom, being Medusa, was this kind of, she felt ugly all the time, but she's waiting for the hero to come and justify her existence. That's how that was. So I recognized my own ability to look at life metaphorically, but I wasn't getting any reward for being who I was. And when you're not getting any kind of validation at all, you're going to turn to the dark side in that way. And that
you know, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just, it's that, I think, is very crucial to the book and the arc of the character, the main character, Christian. And another thing about why I named him Christian, you know, like I felt, I've always been into history. And in school, they always talked about the Puritans, right? And puritanical Christianity is all about your God is holding you right there at the devil, right there at fire. And he's holding you. He's like, if you sin, I will let you go, right? And that's how I felt. I felt like I was always betwixt and between this like heavenly state, which was maybe college when I would leave or be by myself, and then right over the fire, which was with my parents. So Christian is in that dynamic in the whole book. And I think that's
Yeah, literally in the hot seat. That's me of the classic Puritan Jonathan Edwards and his famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And
Yes.
when he spoke that sermon, very puritanically, by the way, he just spoke it solemnly with no gestures and very quietly. And supposedly, the people in the pews responded so frightened to his sermon that they say that there were even fingerprints left in the pews,
Wow.
back of the pew.
Wow. That's
People
amazing.
holding on to it, afraid that they were going to fall in the hellfire. But I understand that pressure. I understand that. I can entirely see that. And so Stone, Christian's father, is this dominating character that, and you could tell that there's really no love between those two. And quite honestly, Christian's mother is someone to be pitied in a sense. But for, and going back to the bio, you say that you mentioned that this incident with the police happened when you were a senior.
In high school, yeah.
High school, okay. So this was 4 years before your father actually, all these things happened. You get diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
You eventually drop out of Princeton, and also your father passes away. All that happens in a short period of time, correct?
Yeah. It happened within 3 months of each other, I guess.
3 months. Wow, that is a lot. So with Christian, it's kind of interesting. Christian gets out, and he, again, not only does he have to audition to get out of the psychiatric hospital, he is waiting. His parents are waiting for him at a diner where he's got to audition to them and kind of perform and convince them that he's quote unquote better. That's hearing these voices. Okay.
Right.
And again, there's still this kind of ominous backstory that we're not privy to until the next chapter. But in that next chapter, we find him back at the fictional Princeton, which is Parthenon University. And he's actually in front of a woman named Dean Maiden. And she actually is the one who has the ability to allow him back into school under certain conditions. So we see Christian sitting before her, okay, with the parents. Not only that, you mentioned this as well. You mentioned that there was a student liaison who, for whatever reason, heard about Christian's situation as well, and was not really friendly towards Christian. Is that based on a true experience as well, where other people knew about your diagnosis?
Yeah, I came back and people were saying to me, they're like, "Oh, we thought you died, man. You weren't here for the first week." I guess they were joking. They were being hyperbolic. But, the student liaison is a representation of my fears of telling people the truth, and my vulnerability at that time. I knew that some people knew through the wire and through the grapevine that something was going on with me. I think some people thought maybe something was going on with my mental state too, because I was always very hyper in college. I was very energetic in college up to that point. And I remember distinctly multiple people saying, "Hey, it's good to see the calm Justin, that's Justin, blah, blah." But I was like, I'm not calm, I'm being sedated. This is a sedentary me. This is half of me. This is me uncomfortable. I don't know why people can't recognize me. I felt like I was like this person that was, whatever I was projecting was not real to me. And there was this, and sometimes with, there's this depersonalization, right, that I was experiencing, where I was starting to, in some ways, awake and ascend to a point where I was really starting to realize, who are my friends? Who are not my friends? Do I really have any friends? Before that, when I was a junior, I'd sit by myself and I'd say, let me hit up someone to hang out. But then after I got diagnosed and I was there senior year, I was like, why is it that I'm always reaching out? Is anyone ever reaching out to me? And the answer was really Rarely. I had one friend, Elliot, who would reach out to me all the time. We were very close friends. He passed away the same year my dad passed away. Um, so, and I remember, here's where the student liaison comes in too, is I spoke at kind of a convening of people at our eating club, at Princeton we have eating clubs, Tiger and people were there just talking about Elliot, sharing stories and things like that. And then I got up and I started crying, and people knew I was close to him. And I said, at a very vulnerable moment, I said, everybody who tells me they love me, they all just leave me. They either die or they just fucking leave. Um, and a kid put his arm around me and said, "We're your family now." But then the next week, I heard that like 3 girls in the club were making fun of me, saying that I had said too much and I was being inappropriate. And I was like, my best friend just fucking died. Like, be a human, And
So what you're saying, let me clarify this to make sure I understand what you're saying. So the fact that people knew that you had a psychiatric break at some point now colored their view of your mourning. So therefore, put it this way, if that had not happened, if no one knew that you had had this situation, people would have considered your behavior entirely normal. Crying in front of in a public gathering. Okay, got it. So essentially you're saying that there is this stigma attached to you for having had this ending up in the hospital.
Yeah, it was the worst. At the time, I thought it was the worst decision of my life to agree to walk into the hospital that I did and get that diagnosis. I put my full faith and trust in my parents, and I wished that I could have just gone to see a doctor and been like, I'm dealing with anxiety. But I had always been open about that. I had always been open with people that I deal with a lot of anxiety, blah, blah, blah. And my parents never did anything about it. So I felt betrayed. I felt betrayed because I was like, oh, now that it's possibly bipolar, now you want to do something about it because I'm an albatross. I'm a pariah to you. But when it was just anxiety, okay, well, everybody's got,
That entirely makes sense. Things are going well for Christian. Okay, even though there's something unexpected that happens in the dean's offices, but they still allow him to come to. She still allows him to come to school. Actually, welcomes him back into school, and things are going well for Christian. And he's not having any incidents. The voices aren't popping up in his head until it's a situation that happens maybe a month or two into him being back in school, where he dares to do something that he used to do all the time, which was he was going to go out on the town. He's going to go out to one of the eating clubs, right? To his eating club. He's just going to enjoy himself that evening. He's done with his homework. He goes out. And unfortunately, while he is there enjoying himself, he begins to have, for the lack of a better word, intrusive thoughts, where he feels like he sees someone that part of his brain tells him it can't be really there, but this character engages him. And so he is doing what his parents would want him to do, what he thinks the school would want him to do, and definitely what the psychologist would want him to do, the psychiatrist, which is deny, don't give in to that experience. Don't give into it. And so he does that. However, he can't entirely get away, because what happens is this character who is trying to convince him that he is real finally says, okay, you're not going to believe me. You're going to believe them. Tell you what, I'm going to give you a challenge. And this challenge, if you accept it, the implication will be you can never, ever not know if you're hearing voices, if you got psychosis, or if there's another option. So, and the challenge this character gives them is to do something. And this is when we really learn, fuller what Christian did before to get him in trouble. Because evidently he made a public spectacle of himself that frightened a lot of people and endangered a lot of reputations, which is why he ended up in the hospital in the first place. That story there, where he is challenged to expose himself at the highest point, by the way, in the school, to climb a flagpole in the middle of a storm, by the way, butt naked, I would say as well, and then wait, which he's prone to those sorts of challenges because those are the voices he's been listening to. But he's also trying to do the right thing. He's trying to graduate. This is his senior year. He's fine. He got to school. Was it a month late? So he's trying to play catch up, or several days late anyways. So what is that based on an actual incident that happened with you?
Yeah. So I didn't have any I can't remember any public displays of embarrassment like that, like him, at least that I can think of. But I do remember distinctly this notion of wanting to express in the story that when you are bipolar, you may suffer from delusions. Now, these delusions don't have to be really grandiose. It could just be one specific thing, like I just got to get to Kentucky, or I just got to climb this ladder, or this pole, this building. You don't really know why. Something you feel like is calling you. Now, what I would try to explain to people, at least my parents, was at a religious level, why is this strange, right? I said to them, look at the prophets in the Bible. My mom grew up in a Christian house. My dad grew up exposed to Christianity. Look at Isaiah, right? Isaiah is called by God to be a prophet, right? Now, I wasn't calling myself a prophet, but I was saying that if Isaiah existed today, he'd be in the hospital. If Jesus existed today, he'd be in the hospital. If any of these characters existed from any religion, like Buddha or whatever, they'd be in the hospital today, right? And you wouldn't have these great world religions and philosophies. They'd be truncated. So I said to myself, what if I'm being called in a small way by something inside? I don't know what it is. I can't explain it. I can't explain the nature of it. But something is telling me to wake up to reality in a different way. Maybe I'm not articulate enough to really explain what I'm going through. Maybe I'm so scared, right? Maybe I'm so traumatized. But I'm telling truths when I was speaking. When I was speaking to people and saying that I think it's possible that something deeply spiritual is happening to me. No, it can't be. It's all science. But then, these are the same people that would go to the church pews on Sunday and whatnot. So
tell us about the snowstorm, because this
it's the snowstorm. So my last day on Princeton's campus as a student was it was in the winter of 2011, and I was in my room, and I was there in the snowstorm because I was supposed to be home, and I was home, and I was thinking of my friend Elliot, who had passed away, and I just got this notion that I needed to run. I don't know where it came from. It's almost like I could feel this power telling me, run. You never run. Why don't you run? If you hate everything about your life, if you hate your family, if you hate your life as it is, if you hate school, if you hate your situation, why don't you just leave? Take the risk, right? It was in my head. I was like, what does every great religious character eventually have to do? They have to leave home, right? Jesus goes into the wilderness, right? Buddha escapes home. So I said to myself, that's what I got to do. So I called up my grandfather. I said, can you drive me to the train? I didn't even say goodbye to anybody. And he drove me to the train. I was on the train, and I was sitting in my room after that, and the storm came. And I heard from a friend, or at least an acquaintance, who said, have you seen this storm? It's weird. It's like pink and purple sky and blah, blah, blah. And I was saying to myself, well, this sounds pretty fascinating. and I went out to the storm. And I always liked storms because they were so powerful. But this was snowing sheets. You couldn't see in front of your face. And I said, I don't care what happens tonight. I don't care if I get hurt or if I die or if I get lost. I'm going to wander in the storm and figure some shit out. And I was remembering I was by the football stadium, and I said to myself, I got to go in there. There's peace in there. I don't know why, but I said, there's got to be some peacefulness that I can achieve, some clarity by going out and sitting in the stadium. That was the stadium where freshman year, we used to do all these kind of stair workouts on the rowing team, going up and down. And, I loved being on the rowing team. The only reason why I stopped was because physically my body was breaking down to a point where I was sweating at night. I couldn't get enough calories, whole nine. So to get to the stadium, it was closed. So I had to climb, like Christian, I had to climb something. I had to go through a liminal period and test myself and say, I'm going to make this break, right? The leap of faith we could talk about, like Kierkegaard talks about. I was either going to dangerously climb this thing, get in trouble or not. So I climbed this fence, and this fence was huge. I mean, this fence was as tall as maybe 2 stories. So it was dangerous. And I climbed it. I climbed down. I'm in the stadium and I'm like, wow, like I'm in here, blah, blah, blah. I sat down and I swore I saw an apparition. I saw a woman with a spear looking at me. And I said to myself, it's real. It's not sensical. It's not logical what I'm going through. But deep down inside, there's a deep truth that I'm experiencing. And something out there is tracking my progress, I thought. It's looking at it's like almost like it has, like on ESPN, right? They can track the stats of players. I thought something spiritual out there was tracking my spiritual progress and making that mental break. And then I ran, I jumped off the staircase, I got out of the stadium, and I was a new person. And I was reborn. That's why I call it reborn. And I said, in this baptism of this storm, I'm not coming back. And I didn't return. I mean, I've returned for reunions and things like that, but I didn't return as a student ever.
Yes, so in a sense, Parthenon, not to be too metaphorical, but Parthenon was kind of like represented that patriarchal oversight, that shadow that you could not get out of and think clearly. It's like your father overshadowed you,
Mm-hmm.
the home overshadowed you, the school overshadowed you, and so it's almost like no, didn't matter where you went, you were still under that shadow. So this kind of sense was a break where this is where you're leaving that. You're leaving that life. And you, quite honestly, like you said, you're reborn. This is you're a quote unquote new creature. So I see how the religious symbolism and the mythological symbolism really plays into this book. So that's fascinating. So without giving away the rest of the story, I do want to talk about the theme, which is one of the overarching themes, which is ascendance, or hierarchy, or getting to the top, because one of the very first time that any character speaks in your book, it's the word ascend. Actually, it's a voice of something in Christian's head. It's a voice in his head saying that. But we see this ascendancy. We see this kind of trying to pull himself up from his bootstraps, which is one form of ascension. Trying to get out of the psychiatric hospital back into school in order to graduate, in order to make his parents proud. Okay. We've got, we don't mention his grandmother. We haven't mentioned his grandmother, but, Sophie, who was dying, actually knows him. She's almost like his spiritual guide, but she is also, believe it or not, encouraging him along this line of ascension. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think his parents would have appreciated the advice that Sophie was giving him,
No.
But where does ascendancy, where did that figure into the storytelling part? And where are you now with that theme in your in your day-to-day life? Like, is that still part of your kind of hero's quest?
Yeah, I mean, so I, when I was 9, my grandmother got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I tried to put in a positive light. I tried to say, she's become more powerful this way. Her body is dying, her mind is not there, but you can't, I always thought like Socrates says, um, the soul is immortal, right? And the souls of the righteous are divine. So I said something about my grandmother, who was the kindest, most supportive person to me my entire life. I said, she's still around. I could feel her. I know she's got to be around. She's like Obi-Wan Kenobi. She's joined the Force, right? So I based everything I did off of making her proud. And in college, I lost my way with that. I kind of became more of an atheist or an agnostic about it. But that night in the storm, I wasn't. I said, this is what she'd want me to do. She'd want me to find myself and take a risk. She'd yell at my mom. She'd yell at my dad. She'd defend me. So ascendancy is a troubled quest. Apotheosis, the transition of a man to their highest self is or woman is a troubled quest. It's going to be filled with enemies and monsters, just like Joseph Campbell talks about. Right, the hero's journey, it returns you to yourself, but you got to reveal yourself. It reveals all those things when you face the dragon. Right now, the dragon does not necessarily. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was thinking of the other day of the story of Brunhild, the German story where Sigmund has to go and save a princess, Brunhilde, from a dragon. And I was thinking to myself, what if the dragon is not the dragon, but it's the woman? It's Brunhilde itself, right? And think about it as a man in today's world. And I'm a single man. You want to approach a beautiful woman that you see at a bar or somewhere at a park or something. It's kind of monstrous, right? I mean, you got the anxiety. She could turn you down. She could yell at you. She could walk away. It could be all negative. But you got to pass through that crucible to get to the womanness of the person. In anything that you do where there's a challenge, you're always fighting the dragon first. And I think my grandmother armed me when I was a kid to fight that dragon. She used to always play piano with me and teach me lessons about life. She used to always quote revelations about Saint Michael, the avenging angel. She used to call me her Michael in a way. The deep waters of Christianity to my grandmother's Christianity still influence me today in a way where, even though I write about characters that are in polytheistic notions and texts, there's a deep abiding love of the Christian model of forgiveness, but also of avenging to get to ascendancy. I remember distinctly I had a conversation with a doctor at Princeton. This was before my father passed away. We were talking, and I said, my dad, I think, is really sick. I think he's really sick, and I think he's got a mental illness, and I think he needs it. I think he's worse than me. And I said, my whole life, even though I've been angry at him, I'm trying to save him from himself. And this guy looked at me. He looked at me straight in the eye, and he said, you cannot save your father. And the way he said it was like he knew my father. It was like something was channeling through him that was deeply powerful to tell me that. And so with ascendancy, I think, and Christian learns this too, is you got to be a little clever. You can't just, like the Spartans, line up against the Persians and have your shield and your spear, because as brave as the 300 were, they lost. They died, right? But there are other characters, and somewhere in this book, there are other characters in myth that use cleverness, the trickster gods, the coyotes, the Lokis. And when I left Princeton, I started to see myself as the kind of cackling trickster person. That's what I wanted to embody. Because if you can ascend and become that, I think you become undominable. I think you become unconquerable when you can use intellect over brute force. My dad was all about brute force. My mom was all about brute force. I learned from their failure. And that's what I loved about, even if you look at Jesus, when he's talking about the parable, when he's talking to the woman, and he's talking about the parable of something about water, in the New Testament, when he's telling, she's from a rival clan of his. I think she's the Essene or something, and it's I forget the name, but his clan was a rival clan of his, and he tells a story to her about the bride and all this stuff. And you're reading this, and you're like, this doesn't really make any sense. But it's a parable. It's not supposed to. You're supposed to find your way through it. That's why I think it's the power of this of a lot of that.
Right. Fascinating. Well, hey, look, we've got to do another hour, maybe next week or another time, because our hour is up. But this is fascinating, and I've got several other questions I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, we can do a part two.
What's that?
We can do a part two. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's benchmark it. And what we're going to do is I want to focus on this next episode. Let's talk about the women in your life, because Christian actually has many different relationships of varying sorts in the book with women. And they're all very complicated. In fact, particularly the one, well, actually, there's two different kinds. There's kind of like a love triangle or a quadrangle. I can't remember. Yeah, love triangle. But then also you've got the women in his life, like his mother and his grandmother and Dr. Excesso, And so I want to talk about that and kind of like based on your experience where that comes from. But for now, I've actually got to jump. But this is remarkable. Every single time I talk to you, even though I've known you for years, and even though I've been edited your book and I published your book, I learn more and more and more. But suffice it to say, for the young adult writers out there, I think the way I would like to end this in terms of encouragement is if you really look deeply into your own experience, your own life experience, and you write what you know, we were talking about this yesterday, that's what you identify as mastery. Mastery is knowing yourself so well that you can take those elements and you speak about what you know. You don't speak about what you don't know, because we all come across the books, the YA books and other books where we're like, oh, that's just a copy of, I don't know, Lord of the Rings, and it just right. falls flat because that human intransigent element is just lacking, So let's do that. We'll say next time we'll talk about the woman in your life, and we'll go from there to that to the very end of the book. There's about maybe 5 or 6 other themes I'm going to talk about, so we can help these YA authors get an idea of what that knowing yourself so well, particularly through this kind of the valley of the shadow of death, in terms of your own mortality, your old self dying, in terms of the diagnosis of this bipolar disorder, your father passing, and your mother having to go through all that she went through, and then you having to reinvent yourself in terms of what do I do for a career. So anyways, this was awesome, man. Thank you so much.
It was awesome. Yeah. And we'll continue with part 2.
Awesome.
Hey, welcome back to the Trendy Place. This is the Trend Podcast with Justin A.Williams, and we are continuing our conversation, an interview of myself, Justin A.Williams, with the great Robbie Grayson, and we're going to get right into it.
Hey, Justin, thank you very much for letting me interview you last time, and thanks for letting me have another segment.
Sure, of course.
I feel, as your publisher, working with you all these years, I learned a lot in the first segment that I did not know while I was working with you. Right. So a lot of the questions I asked you, quite honestly, kind of follow the rabbit trail of some of the things that interested me based on what you said. But now what I really want to do is I really want to kind of offer a template for other YA authors and how personal experience figures into storytelling. Because as I say, you can only write what you know. But if a potentially YA author has been inspired by, say, The Hunger Games or by Lord of the Rings or by any number of lore out there, oftentimes they find themselves mimicking parts without a real understanding of how that all weaves together. And so what they end up doing is they end up creating almost like a parody of a great book, so that when a reader is reading it, they're like, oh, come on, this is just like so-and-so with different names, or just like on a different planet. So this story really was born out of these emotional struggles that Justin had.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to tell you as well, your face is thinned out since last week. Have you done anything like this past week?
Yeah, I just been doing a lot of lymphatic work. So a lot of times when you're losing weight, and I'll tell the audience, I've lost almost 100 pounds in the past 3 years. When you're doing a lot of weight loss work, it affects your lymphatic system, right? So you can get a lymphatic massage anywhere pretty much in your body, but you want to massage the thyroid because the thyroid is the key to weight loss, right? The thyroid regulates your hormone balances, and hormonal imbalance can really affect whether you're effective at losing weight. And so besides just working out and a carnivore diet that I'm on, eggs, vegetables, meat, I also have been doing some lymphatic techniques that have really worked in the past week, and I've been doing it for about 2-3 weeks now. But it's really been effective for me in terms of dropping size. A lot of times, you lose fat, and then water fills the fat cell, so that's all lymphatic.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, I just saw you a few weeks ago, and you look good, but you look, and then I saw you through a video last week, but there's a marked difference.
Right.
But and obviously, all of the weight loss is connected to emotion, right?
Yes.
No.
Yes. So back to your question. Yes, I think parody happens a lot of times in writing, not just fantasy writing, a lot of writing. I think it's because people sometimes they struggle to separate the fan inside them with the writer inside them, right? Like I'm a fan of Tolkien. So if I wanted to do a parody, I would say, well, what works before? Step by step, just do what Tolkien did every single step of the way, and you'll be successful. A lot of people are doing parody, but if you really want to get respect from the community, from your fans, and you really want to be remembered as unique, you should really focus on saying to yourself, what is my story within this context? How do I avoid the common steps, right? Maybe there's a deviation I can take that can make the book more interesting, right? Maybe in the hero journey, instead of using all 12 steps where they use, maybe I try to add a 13th step. Maybe I don't have it at the end, I have it in the middle, right? When we were writing this book, you and I, Robbie, we found that we had to switch from first person to third person. And that really brought the book to life in a new way. And it really made me a better writer. So I think another thing you can do as a young writer is find somebody at a college or grad school. If you don't have the money to pay a professional editor, find someone who's hungry and who knows literature and will do it for pennies on a dollar to get their name out there, and let them criticize and read your book. And I'm sure they'll be very anxious to do it. When I was at Princeton, we had a writer's center where people were scared. I was scared too. I'd have to bring my junior thesis and my senior thesis over and say, hey, what do you think? What do you think of these ideas? And you got to get used, you got to pull the Band-Aid off and get used to criticism. Because even if you write the next opus, if you write the next Dune, right? People still criticize Dune and harshly, right? On the internet, things like that. You're going to get criticism. You gotta write something that's original, because if you get criticized for writing parody, it's going to doubly affect you negatively.
See, I'm one of the critics of Dune. Just too much sand.
Okay, yeah.
No, my wife loves it. But so, that's a really good point that you made about when I was working with you as your editor. We did have to go from first person to third person. And I think one of the reasons we did was because as first person, we couldn't tell if your main character was actually delusional or not, if he was suffering from psychosis or not, because it's all his word. You know, it's all his reference. So when he makes the change, when he has this experience where he crosses the threshold, we're not quite certain if he's going from psychosis to crazy.
Right.
So that was really interesting. And this is all based kind of on Stephen King's concept that you don't overlay your story with plot. Plot are the footsteps that remain after a character makes decisions. So going back to this kind of way of interrogating you, whereby I'm asking you how your experiences figured into your main character's decision-making. I want to talk about that whole mental health kind of aspect. So when you wrote the book, you wrote it in first person, okay? And not only that, but we talked last week about how you have a lot in common with your main character, okay? So, and you wrote the book pretty fast too, right?
3 months.
3 months. That's pretty fast. And when I saw it, I was like, there's something genius here. We just got to clean it up a little bit to find out what it was. But so when you wrote, what was the structure? Were you following the character according to the situations you'd experienced? Or was there some sort of a mega plot or mega narrative you were overlaying the story with?
I think I was looking at more of trying to actually think like one of the characters in my book in terms of what he would write, right? So I was thinking, I'm not going to write this as a personal requiem to my pain and trauma. I've done that before. I wrote a book before that I gave to you called we'll talk about that at some other time.
Great.
But and that's more of a horror book, right? There's a lot of Gothic elements in that. And I grew up reading a lot of Gothic literature. And Gothic literature is great to learn with because it's not so much about plot. It's about pathos. It's about emotion. And what I wanted to do with Reborn was one day I was sitting by myself in the kitchen and I had actually just gotten off the phone with a psychic I was talking to. And they were talking to me about my next 5 years. And they said, your first book that you wrote, that's not going to be the big one yet. They said it's going to be the second one that's going to push you to the stars, right? And I said, that's interesting because I haven't written a second book. So maybe I said, what do I do here? And I thought to myself, because I was mature enough at the time, having written another book, what can I do differently than I did the first time, right? Because what can I do structurally that's going to differentiate them? Because let's say if they were both out there, I don't want to have duplicates. So Reborn is something that I could not sit and just fantasize about and imagine the scenes coming to me and write. That's what I did with my first book. I would go to the movies. I'd go anywhere I could for inspiration, the beach, the park, and I would just sit and stare off in the distance and just kind of get the story. This book, I constructed it, writing it down and thinking, okay, I want to go here, 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 and here. And the main point behind all that was I wanted to show people that I could technically be a good writer. I didn't want to just have a book that was just great ideas. I wanted to show some kind of technique. And obviously when we switched to third person, I think that came alive even more. But this book is really a book that doesn't come from my imagination as much as it comes from effort. And if that sounds confusing, what I can say is that effort is when it doesn't come naturally and you really have to sit and calculate, what's going to be the next best part of this book. There are so many times I'm writing Reborn and I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to have this scene here, maybe a sex scene here, a romantic scene here, or I want to have this big powerful battle or this and that. And then I'm thinking to myself, I've done that before. Let me challenge myself. Let me hold back on some of my instincts and write maybe if I was in dialogue with Christian Belvedere, what would he want next? If I was in dialogue with the Loki character, what would he do next? And I really tried to make it kind of like how Tarantino or Noah Hawley is a big influence of mine. And I talk about this on my lives on Facebook. Noah Hawley wrote Legion, which was a TV show about the son of Professor X. And he's very similar to my character, right? Is he mad or is he divine? And at the end of that story, they say he's kind of both. And I want, at the end of this story, for people to have a similar notion of the madness, divinity. Are they one? Do they cause each other? Do they conflict each other? Is it all of that? And that was all on purpose. I think sometimes when I was writing my first book, I would surprise myself because I'd wake up the next day and I'd say, "Wow, did I write all that? Like, wow, this is stuff that's moving me." But I feel like it's not me. It's also coming from somewhere.
It's kind of interesting. The old Greek concept of the muse,
yeah,
was a spirit that actually takes hold of you just temporarily.
Mm.
But when the muse is gone, the muse is gone.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting. I think the power, though, of you also going from first person to third person really made you have to think, because you can't share with your reader everything that's going on in your character's mind. You demonstrate through other characters who aren't entirely aware of what's going on in the main character's mind. So that's where I really feel that there was some serious characterization. Like there's the characterization of Wep, who, when I first read Wep, reminded me of Robin Williams' role in Aladdin, as the genie. Wep was just like, okay, is Wep serious or not? Wep felt like to me, like an old frat guy who just, who was 20 years outside of having graduated from college, but college was like the apex of his life.
Yeah.
Using a lot of, kind of vulgarity and just terminology that he thought was coming across hip and cool, but necessarily
right.
But it was really cool. So, but outside, as you were developing Wep, sometimes Wep came across several times Wep came across very seriously. And some of the things that he would say, whereas when you've got Christians saying, well, this is what Web said, it's like, I don't even know if this guy is sane. So I thought that was a really good move. So being able to get into your other characters and looking at them, looking at their name, looking at with the history that you've given them, and then saying, okay, in this situation, in this little incubation lab, if I left them to themselves, what would they do? What do I see myself? What do I see them doing? So when you're going all over the place, traveling, going to the beach, and sitting off and staring off into the distance and wondering what these characters would do, I think that's a really good kind of modus operandi to kind of get out of your head and into the head of your characters. But you use mythology, because really this book is about mythology. And what I love about it is that it's about mythology, but it's also about, a university that, fictional though it is, a university that in 2024. So you've got, these are all Gen Zers, okay, essentially, who are cream of the crop, because it's an Ivy League school, the equivalent of an Ivy League school. But they're also not aware that there is a large puppeteer out there who is deciding a lot of their decision making. And that is to say, it's this whole concept of virtues constellation. It's your meta narrative of how the Greek gods are finding a way to be reborn. And because they failed last time, I don't know, when you first start reading the book, you're thinking, so when the Greek gods died, at least in people's imaginations a long time ago, and gave away to Christianity, for example, culturally, it's like, okay, they had their time. And at first you think, oh, they're resurrecting and they're coming back with a vengeance. But you describe how in your storyline, no, there have been many times since then, where the quote unquote Greek gods have tried to resurrect and take power over again. And you mentioned some of these historical events. I think, did you mention 9/11 as maybe even an example, not necessarily in the book, but at least in the making of this, where you was that the idea that the Greek gods were experimenting? And, or maybe I'm getting that mixed up with M. Night Shyamalan's The Unbreakable.
Oh, right. M. Night Shyamalan also had a movie that came out about 2 years ago about a family in a cabin in the woods, and like some people come and they talk about the end of the world, and it's like a 9/11 event.
Yeah.
I lived, first of all, yes, in some ways, I lived through 9/11. I was a freshman in high school, and I remember the sheer terror and also the hope of that day when you saw the first responders, the heroism you saw from people, the patriotism afterwards. So it was an interesting time. And I think for me, in the back of what's going on is Reborn is the story of our story, where people are starting to say it's not so strange to say there's some cabal that is, or cabals that are behind the scenes, right? I think if you talk to about anybody 20 years ago, maybe 10% of the people would have a normal conversation with you about that. And 10%, and maybe 5% of those people are like stable enough mentally that you're going to find them credible. But I think now you could go up to about maybe 70 to 80% of the population of people who are over the age, I mean, maybe even teenagers, over the age of 13. And you're going to have a conversation where you'd say, do you think maybe there's something going on with some collusion of powers of elites? And they'll be like, yeah, of course. Right? Because programming, if you look at Marvel, if you look at DC, if you look at anything that enraptures people today, what is S.H.I.E.L.D., right, in the Marvel universe? What is Argus in the DC universe? These are elite-driven secret organizations. So it's not so strange. So in my book, I wanted to give a little fodder to people who are interested in understanding how the world really works. And the world has always worked with elites driving it. I mean, from monarchies to empires. Why is it so strange to consider that Rome never really fell? You know, that's my theory as a historian. I'm a historian. I'm in the Phi Beta I'm in the Historian Society from college. I'm also someone who's a religion major studying on the Cornell West and Eddie Glaude at Princeton. And besides that, I'm just someone who grew up with a father who was an investigator. You know, on his free time, he'd be reading the Truths of Mott or the Emerald Tablets of Thoth and stuff like that. So I believe in the connectivity of societies and religions. I think there's more connectivity, and there's a genius in the ancient times that we are missing out on. They are more advanced than we think they were. They were more responsible. I mean, when you see societies, right, that they say they had no writing, but yet they built pyramids and things like that needed high-level math. I think it's racist and stupid to say they had no math. Of course they had math. The Mayans knew what zero was. They had math, right? The Dogon tribe knows that Sirius is a binary system. They have these things. Maybe they don't need to write it down. Maybe they're smart enough they don't need to, and you should respect that, right? So in my opinion, the Greek gods, in some way in this book, have been siphoning through society and society as they change. And they've been responsible for some of the major events that have gone on, right? Until the point where they got enough power in the human system where they could relax a little bit. But then Stone has Osiris as a child, and that upends everything, right? When Stone has Osiris as a child, what this being before was immaculate. Now he was dead. How does that happen? That makes him scared. Now he's back alive. Is he on our side? Is he not? What are you going to do, Stone, to groom this person so that he's a reflection of us and our interests? And so when he has the visions and at the school, and then he, you know, at first, what's insinuated in the book is that Stone was not going to have him go to a hospital. Stone was going to apprehend this person, explain it to him, and then commandeer that person as a powerful entity. Couldn't reach him in time, right? Because if you know anything about schools, the second you climb a building, there's going to be security. There's going to be people there. So Stone can't get in there without revealing himself. So when you go to Angel Fire, where Dr. Accesso, it's implied that Dr. Accesso,
which is the psychiatric hospital,
right?
At the very beginning of the book. Yeah.
Yes. When you go there, there's some insinuation that, because he hears a voice, right? Could that be Stone? Right? There's an insinuation that Accesso is on the team. Obviously, if you know what Accesso comes from. And if she's on the team, well then, okay, some plot is going on here to make up for the fact that it's complicated now for him. And it was complicated, and a little bit about me, it was complicated for me going back. You know, when I was diagnosed and I went back to school, I didn't know who knew. I knew that some people, it trickled out to them. I didn't know who would still talk to me, be my friend or anything, if I could be social. I felt totally stigmatized, not because I was ashamed of getting medication and help. I eventually talked to a lot of students who were on medication and things like that. I talked to a lot of students that had mental issues and things like that. It was the stigma of the fact that maybe they thought, oh, that explains every single behavior of mine, right? And I didn't want that. I wanted to be someone who says, no, some of my behaviors, like if I get really emotional, this is not my mental illness talking. This is me being a real person. If I have like a thought on a religion and it's controversial, this is not me being manic, right? But Christian Belvedere, like myself, you get put into a box and then people are going to treat you with kid gloves. Even people who mean well are going to keep that distance from you. So for my 20s and up until the time of writing Reborn, I had to deal with the stress of people keeping me at arm's length. And it's only until now where I feel like people don't do that anymore.
That's interesting. You mentioned something we've talked about occasionally that I think would be a fascinating discussion, and it has to do with race. So the Greek gods obviously represent kind of like, in a sense, dominant culture, whereas Osiris represents this ancient, probably more ancient pantheon of Egyptians who are, we'll say, the darker peoples, right? Okay, so here you've got this son of God, so to speak, who's been reborn. Of course, when we find out who his father is, it's like, how can that happen? You know, but there is this clash, even sociologically on campus, the way that Christian is treated, not just because he's perceived to have mental issues, but also because it's perceived by his visual makeup that he has not had a pedigreed life, experience, which is not necessarily true, actually. But we see this come up occasionally. There's a scene where Christian is playing server at an event on campus. And the opposition, like, what do you call it? Like student groups. Is it Ligerin? No.
Yeah, Ligerin is one of them.
Python. No, Python.
Python is the enemy, yeah.
Python, yeah. So he is serving at an event in Python. Mm-hmm. And we find out that it is within Python where the Greek gods are wielding their strongest power, because they have kind of taken over the intentions of a lot of the students. But so he's like he's basically, when he's doing some, what would you call it? Like underground kind of spying at this event as a waiter. He passes out and he finds himself in a room surrounded by a group of characters who have an idea, at least the lead guy has an idea, that Christian is not who he says he is, that is to say, just a waiter.
Yeah.
And there is this game of risk, basically, that ensues. Tell us about that and how that conversation is a catalyst for the reader to understand that this is this is a sociological issue that goes back. It's a mythological issue, but it's also sociological. It's also, there's racial implications. So tell us how you use that as a literary device to get the reader to understand that there's a lot of things going on. But one of the things that are happening is the fact that Christian is being discriminated against.
Right. So here's the thing. There are different ways you can get someone to buy into your book and buy into a scene, right? Too many people think, how do I get people to buy into a book? It's scene by scene. And the way you get someone to buy into your scene is you have to make it relatable to them in a simple packaged way. And then you can get more complicated, right? It's like breathing, right? You start in and then out, right? So the book has to breathe. So what I wanted the story was, yes, it's complicated. He's a secret agent kind of thing. He's a waiter. He's trying to spy, but he's also kind of goofy about it. And he's failing, right? That's very relatable. Wep is doing his bro thing, so that's kind of some comedic relief. Bathos is what they call it when you deflate a scene's emotionality with comedy. But then he passes out. Now, to be unconscious, to pass out is to sleep, and to sleep is to dream into another world. So when he wakes up, is it a mental thing that's happening to him? Is he, it's a book of mythology. So where is he now? Where he sleeps, he goes to the consciousness of now things are being revealed. He's more relaxed. He's better, and that comes from me. When I was in college, I used to play Risk with my friends, and I used to have these notions that we were like the gods playing Risk with humans, and moving pieces around and delegating. That I was the god of war. I was like Ares, or I was like some god or something like that. And the book kind of came from that because we would joke and heckle as if we were these characters. And then I would go to sleep and, I'd be very anxious during the day. I had a lot of anxiety I was dealing with. Acupuncturist said I had a lot of body chi caught up in my back from trauma and knots and tightness that was just like this all the time. So I had to relax that. Acupuncture helped, but then I had to do my own meditation routines for decades. But back to what I'm saying is I would wake up and I'd have 5 minutes of clarity and relaxation and peace when I'd wake up. And then it would slowly go away. So I saw waking up as clarity. So when he wakes up, he's in a moment of clarity. People are going to be honest with. People are going to say, well, we don't need to hide with this guy. We know he's hiding. So if we don't hide, maybe he'll come out, right? If we reveal ourselves, he'll reveal himself because he's an insecure, attention-needing college kid. We know you, Christian Belvedere. You've been popular, and you dated Dite. You dated the hottest girl in school, the biggest influencer in school. You were on the sports team. You have everything going for yourself. And now look at you. You're slovenly here in our club, passing out and waking up now to our control. Because why are you a waiter here? We know you're not a waiter. You snuck in. You weren't invited. We can do some damage to you. You know what I mean? So they have leverage. And these Olympians, they're all about leverage. They're all about, these are higher-minded beings. If you think of like an Apollo or Zeus existing, think of all like the access to knowledge they have if they can access any moment in time, right? Like one of my favorite Greek gods is Helios, because Helios can see all. Well, if he can see all, then he can read any book at any time. He can know any story. He can know any experience that's publicly known, maybe privately known. I mean, he's the one that catches Ares and Aphrodite together and tells Hephaestus right in the midst. So if you have vision, then you can get into that. And one of the characters that Christian has to face then is in that scene is a Helios-like character, Apollo, right? So he's facing some real tough competition at that point. And I wanted the reader to really feel like he wakes up to a nightmare, a potential nightmare. And I wanted some of those elements to come out. There's a great scene where Christian is told by someone that cares about him, I keep the book of Greek mythology at the bottom of my books because that shit is kind of dark and people don't think of it as being dark. They read these stories of like Hera being hung from the sky in children's books. And they don't realize that some children are smart enough to be like, this is kind of grim. What were the Greeks really trying to say?
Right. That's fascinating. So there's conversation about Christian's kind, so to speak, in this, or the people group of which Christian is, and how it was not their lot in life, so to speak, to be privileged.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. However, the guy who heads up that conversation still wants to have dinner with Christian later on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, and he looks, and not only that, but he gets a friend out of that, so to speak, a kind of a competitive friend, Paulie, who wants him to go on a run later on. But what did you mean by that, by having that conversation during that game of Risk? Were you meaning for Christian? What was it, a catalyst for Christian to realize, hold on, these things that I've been thinking about myself, my identity, they've got to be true.
Right. Yeah.
Was it nudging him out? Because Christian is doubtful, even though he's been told who he is. He's testing the waters, trying to figure this out. But how? So if Christian were before that event, if Christian were, we'll say, 30% convinced that he was actually Cyrus, how much more convinced is he after having this encounter?
Yeah, he's pretty much 100% there. He's not necessarily feeling like comfortable and prepared. He's not as excited as he thought he might be. I think when he was at 30%, he's kind of like, let me use this to my advantage. Let me use my own illusion. Let me softly figure this out. Dip my toe in the water, right? Like discovering the Lady of the Lake, and she has the sword Excalibur, right? Let me just, slowly get to her. Once he meets with Paulie, that sword is thoroughly thrusted into him, and he can't get it out. And once it's in there like that, you have to consider so many ramifications. Like, what else exists, right? What else out there is there? And can I trust anybody that I meet? So it exacerbates the psychosis, you see, because it creates more paranoia. And I can relate to that in my own personal life, because one night, and this is where I got that scene from, was one night I was in college, and I had just almost drowned from kind of a canoe or a kayak, and I tipped over, and I was ruminating on that and thinking, what if I had died? I made total peace with it there, and now I'm alive. I made total peace when I was underwater with, I am going to drown. I can't do anything about it. I let go, and I felt this amazing catharsis, and now I'm still here sitting. And I felt like I was in a box. I felt like, no, like I didn't want to die, but I did want to transcend. And, anyone who knows anything about me knows that I struggled mightily sophomore year and on with a lot of things from either my father or people I knew, and just trauma and all this stuff. So I started to, with this scene, feel like, okay, maybe there's a game going on. Maybe I'm stuck in a game, in a matrix, right? That's the theory that's so popular now, people talk about the matrix. Life is a simulation, right? And I started to think about escape. I started to think about escapism. And Apollo, if you know anything about Apollo, the god, he has a lyre, right? Or a lyre. He plays these strings. But if you look at the shape of a lyre, right? It's got the body. It's got what connects? It's got the neck, right? Right. So you got those connections, and then it's got the brain at the top, and it resounds. Remember, the Greeks thought of music as magical. They did not scientifically look at sound as a science only. They saw sound as a scientific magic, a magical effect that would happen in an incantation, right? So Apollo is the one that plays your strings. He's the ultimate trickster. He's the ultimate manipulator, because he's the one that can say, he's really more like Loki than anybody else. In fact, in the myths, Apollo says, I go to Hyperborea, which is in the north, to teach, right? So is Apollo Loki? In my mind, I'm thinking about these coordinates and how people used to think. So I play with that a little bit, that Apollo is looking at, as Pauly is looking at Christian saying, let me make music out of you, right? Because his whole thing is he's the new blood. Some of the old blood is thinking, we're taking over the world. You know, we can do damage here or there. Let's just move pieces around. What are we going to do? But Pauly's thinking, no. I have new ambitions and I'm going to recruit. I need an army of my own, right? Because Zeus and Apollo conflict. So let me look at this Christian Belvedere and maybe make something out of him. He won't know it. He doesn't need to know. He doesn't need to know my strings are being played, but the strings are being played nonetheless. So there's that aspect to it. And I think and nowhere have I ever seen Apollo depicted in that way, in that correct manner, in that metaphorical manner. And so I think anybody who reads this is going to find really interesting ways that I use the archetypes of these divine beings in ways that they haven't seen before.
Christian's father, his name is Stone. How did you come up with that name? And symbolically, what is the relationship of Christian to his father? Or why did you give Christian the father you gave him?
Well, it's based off my own. It's based off the men in my family. It's based off the relationship my father had with his father, where you got someone who's as stubborn as a rock, right? You're between a rock and a hard place, like in an Odyssean story. My father always felt betwixt and between someone who was just intractably just horrible to deal with, and then life itself. And life wasn't easy, right? So stones also, when you cut them open, sometimes have gems. And when I was studying my grandfather, he had a gem inside. I mean, he was a singer at Juilliard. He was brave enough to be in an interracial marriage before it was legal. He seemed like, for all intents and purposes, an incredible individual. He was a football player, almost played for the Giants, played college football. And then his wife at the time leaves the family when my father's 4 years old. And I know from my mom and my grandfather that he became just a horrible, horrible person. But I gotta think maybe he just was heartbroken, right? I mean, the love of your life. If anyone out there has ever loved somebody, I mean, deeply, enough to risk going to jail marrying them, leaves you with no message. There was no letter that my dad found, no message, anything, and leaves this child with you. I mean, that's a pain that he inflicted on my father, and then my father inflicted that on me, right? So I said the buck's got to stop here. So that's why I write. I write so the buck stops here, so that I don't inflict that damage on anyone else. I can just have a character inflict that damage on someone else. And I think, to go back to what you were saying, yes, I think not only is it my father, but Stone is so important to the story because so much of the story is about the beginnings of the clash of the gods with other beings, right? So if you know anything about Kronos, he eats a stone, vomits it up, and then he vomits up Hades and all the other children of Zeus. So Stone is kind of like a Zeus character. He's very much like bravado and machismo, but inside he's got this like damage, this trauma. And I always love writing characters like that. It's so relatable for me. It's such a thing where I can go and get right into exactly how these narcissists act, from any detail. I mean, from like how often they blink to what words they choose. I know precisely how to get in depth in that. So, like I said before about any YA author, you want to know your book like a science. You want to know your characters like a science because they're people you've lived with. It doesn't mean you carbon copy. It means you take what could be interesting to someone else and you use it. You always have to be thinking about your audience. I don't think anyone should ever write a book not considering their audience. Always hope that it's going to be read. Always hope that people are going to like it. And the only way to do that is to consider them sometimes over your own ambitions.
Speaking of that, your book is set in a school setting. Okay.
Yes.
Um, and there are other popular book series, YA series, that have been set among school. Harry Potter, of course.
Mm-hmm.
You got Percy Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even in the Hunger Games, the children are school age, even though there's no school happening, really. You know, your book is set in a university setting, and there are some pretty mature themes. I remember when I got the first draft of your book, I was like, wow, we're going to have to tone this down a little bit. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, what is the attractability because we know that even of Harry Potter, I mean, 26-year-old men. Oh, I'm also thinking of Twilight, because in Twilight, they were in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Twilight, there was a little bit of a romance going on, but in your book, it was, there is this kind of, university culture is a little bit different than high school.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, in university culture, you turn 21 and you can drink, also shagging is like a ubiquitous, pastime, but also these are kind of like in a kind of purgatory. You're kind of like in an in-between. Like, so what kind of power or lenience or poetic license did setting this in a university, college university, do for you that allowed you that maybe high school would have been too restricted, or not being in school at all, being much older just would have fallen on deaf ears?
Yeah. So addressing why you're right. I did choose college specifically for what it offered. The reason is because high school, every day he has to come home to his parents. Right. And I didn't want that consistency. I didn't want that much. I thought that would be a literary box. And what I mean by that is that it would box me into telling the story in a repetitive way every day, right? Because if you want to make it make sense, you can't just have prolonged periods of him being to himself or being with others, because he always constantly has to check in with his parents to get in there. And right. What am I going to do? What, I'm going to have a scene where he just constantly is calling them or texting them? I'd have to reconcile that. College gave me enough space from some of these characters where I could really make them powerfully come in. You only see the mother a couple times, but it's powerful when you do. You only, and there's an intrusiveness to Stone, because it's like, if you're in college and your dad is so involved, is that really something that you want? But you don't have to check in, right? Because there's an understanding you're in college. The reason why I didn't do after college is because that can be some of the most isolating times in a person's life. If I wanted to make it realistic, once you graduate from college, there's going to be a period of like 5 months where maybe you move to New York City and all your friends are there and you're just figuring things out. But within a year or two, everyone's going to get their jobs and they may move away. And then what do? Right? You're starting over. And that's a different story. I wanted something where it felt like everyone was there, and it felt like all the key pieces are easily aligned there, like a chessboard. And I wanted the story to be something where you're questioning, why are the Greek gods in a college? If they're immortal beings that have lasted for maybe millions of years, yeah, you know what? They could stay young, but why are they in college now? What are they doing there? Are they actually taking classes? Are they just having a good time? Are they there for him only? And what is so impactful about college, I think, university life, is you really never forget some of those moments where you really feel like, you know what? I see the difference between me and other people now, or me and my past. I separated myself from my parents in a way where I could really individuate. Christian needs to do this. He needs to grow the fuck up. And I thought that would be the perfect apparatus for him to do that. Yeah.
It works. It works, because we're all so much, we're aware that a semester, is only 9 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we first see Christian at September, he's late coming to school. And we also have an indication that something is going to happen by his birthday, which is in December. So there is a sense of urgency. He's only in college for like 2-3 months, and a lot has to happen during that time. So, yeah, so that's great. Well, gosh, unfortunately, like our hour is like pretty much up, but there's a ton of other questions. There's a few other questions I'm sure I could ask you, but no, this is fascinating. So my hope is that as a publisher and editor, as an editor and publisher, that, writers of YA material could really kind of look at your life, kind of get a peek into Justin Williams' life as a way of how that has informed your book. So my recommendation would be for anyone who's listening to this, if you really want to appreciate this podcast, go out and buy the Reborn first novel, second edition, first novel. You can buy the first edition if you want as well. But so you can actually correlate some of the autobiographical material that Justin has kind of revealed, and see how that has informed the book. But yeah, and I'm sure as well, anyone who is writing a YA novel, if you got any questions, you can go to, what is the name of your website again? What's the URL? Is it?
The Reborn Series.
The rebornseries.com. You can contact Justin there, or I guess through this podcast, huh?
Yeah. You can also find me on Twitter at Dubs Everlasting. That's DUBZ Everlasting. You also find me on Instagram at Professor Jaws. I love taking questions. And on Facebook, we have a whole community. There's about 2,000 or more followers now. It's been growing. Follow me there on my author page. And I do lives every so often. I'm just about twice or 3 times a week. And join the community and let's get this going,
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Justin.
All right. Thank you, Robbie.